We've all seen the headlines coming out of Minnesota, and a lot of you probably think that this is all organic. A lot of you probably think that concerned American citizens are grabbing signs and billboards and running out in protests and jumping on Signal Chat to obstruct ICE agents and Customs and Border Patrol. You might think that that's just a bunch of concerned citizens, and if you thought that, you'd be wrong. You might have a son or daughter who's been exposed to a lot of this pro-Hamas, anti-ICE type rhetoric, and you might think that that's just the generation. Unfortunately, it's not. Today on Off Air, I'm going to tell you the real story behind who is funding the disruption of America. You're going to be surprised about where it's coming from. And I'm also going to tell you exactly why this has all masked inside of Minnesota. Ladies and gentlemen, it's not a coincidence that the largest Somali fraud, the largest healthcare fraud, public program fraud in the country was uncovered in a state governed by Tim Walz. You will find out about the powerful donors involved in this process and why Minnesota has become an epicenter. And you'll find out that this problem isn't going to go away very quickly. But also there are some charges that the Trump administration can file in order to make sure that this is swiftly dealt with. My name is Ron Chapman. I'm a federal criminal defense attorney. I went on Newsmax just recently to speak about Minnesota, which prompted me to film this episode for you today because, of course, on Off Air, we take a bit more time to talk about the things that I don't get to talk about on national news networks. I'm coming to you casual today from Philly. I'm involved in a federal trial, but still carving out some time in the evening to bring this information to you. So without further ado, as they say, let's get down to it. Talk about Minnesota, Governor Tim Walz, big funding donations. You'd be surprised about where they're coming from, and a few surprises from the left that you may not be familiar with. Let's jump into it. Federal agents risking their lives. One of them even got their finger bit off. And of course, we have the unfortunate death of a ICU nurse who decided to bring a gun to what he called was a protest, but really was a felony obstruction of justice effort. This is all going down in Minnesota, and it's reshaping our borders as we see it. Let's start from the beginning. Many of you may not know exactly what a sanctuary city is, and of course, as a lawyer, I think I should probably bring that information to you first so you can understand how this problem is created. When any individual is arrested or detained, often they will be asked questions about their citizenship status, or of course, if people run their information and find that they are in violation of some citizenship status, they would be subject to a detainer request. That would be a detainer request by ICE that sends a request to the local agency once that individual is reported. And that detainer request would say, hey, hold them for a couple of days longer than what you ordinarily would hold them for your charge. So you catch a undocumented illegal alien drunk driving, you hold them in the drunk tank for a while, you press charges against them. And then you would contact Immigrations and Customs Enforcement and say, we have this individual who has stayed way too long on their visa. Would you like us to hold them? Now, in a normal working relationship, what you would normally see is this law enforcement entity, the Minneapolis Police Department, hold them for ICE, and then ICE would decide whether or not they want to detain them for removal proceedings, which are proceedings that are just governed under that part of the statute that removes people who have overstayed their welcome in our country, right? You're violating the law, you get removed. Well, in a sanctuary city, it's a little bit different. You see, in sanctuary cities, some cities have decided that they are not going to respond to removal requests or detainer requests, and they may not hold individuals longer just for the purpose of immigration and customs enforcement. So it creates somewhat of a catch and release situation. You have an unlawful illegal alien who is drunk driving, you take them to the drunk tank, and then when you normally release them like you would after their DUI charge when they're sober, you don't hold them in ICE detention, meaning they go back out on the street. What you end up having in sanctuary cities is a collection of misdemeanor and felony crimes in your population because those individuals weren't held for removal situations. And so, of course, when you're Donald Trump, you go to Governor Tim Walz and you say, hey, Governor Walz, I understand you're running a bit of a sanctuary city there. We've got to go clean up the mess because that's what the American public voted me in for. And Governor Walz says, no way, Jose. We're not going to let you into our city, and we're not going to enforce immigration and customs enforcement on our own people. So, Donald Trump, why don't you come get them? Well, of course, that's exactly what Governor Tim Walz wants, right? He wants the press to see law enforcement, ICE, marching through his towns, engaging in raids to rip his citizens out of their houses, because it riles up the base that he wants to rile up, right? It riles up the base who's excited about tampons in the boys' restroom. It riles up the base that, is going to spend more time attacking itself and crying about it than doing anything constructive for our society. And it riles up the base that just really loves to see unlawful, illegal aliens sitting inside of our country with zero consequences whatsoever, right? Now, why is that important? Well, because that's how Governor Walz gets elected. In fact, if you look at the vote in Minnesota alone, if you look at the electorate, there is zero chance that without the program fraud and without the undocumented migrants being able to vote and get driver's license, he has absolutely zero chance of getting elected. So the king doesn't get to keep his power. Governor Walz doesn't get to keep his power unless he keeps these people inside. The game is almost up. Donald Trump being elected was the worst thing that could have happened for Governor Walz. And really what's happening now is he's paying the piper. And of course, when that has to happen, you have to make some unfortunate friends. And we're going to talk about those unfortunate friends in a little bit, but let's go further. Now, we've got Sanctuary City. We've got ICE coming into town because Walz won't do it for him. We've got Fry doing the same thing. And now we've got Walz standing in front of his electorate saying, we're not going to help these ICE agents. And in fact, you should be reporting them and filming them and getting in their way. Well, they went one step further, which was likely criminal in nature. They engaged rampant obstruction of justice. And a conspiracy to engage obstruction of justice is a RICO charge punishable by a felony. Governor Walz is facing very real obstruction charges along with other members of his cabinet. And here's why. We just recently learned from a very brave reporter that we've got signal chats, encrypted chats being used by protesters on the ground. We call themselves protesters. I think we should really call them rioters. But encrypted signal chats are being used to communicate throughout the city. Now, if you went to Minneapolis right now and you wanted to go find out the location of an ICE raid so that you could film it, you would have a very difficult time. Why? These things don't happen all over the city. In fact, only a couple of times a day, ICE might leave the compound and go take some sort of action. In a large city like Minneapolis, there's absolutely no chance that you as a general reporter are going to figure this out. But Governor Walz doesn't want that. Governor Walz doesn't want mostly empty streets. He wants to make it look like Minneapolis is in riot conditions 100% of the time. And so what he's done is mobilize individuals by using these signal chats to find out the location of ICE. And once they find out the location of ICE, they swarm ICE with protesters and rioters and have those individuals engage in a bunch of obstructionist conduct to prevent ICE from doing its job. Now, protests are demonstrations that normally happen in a single place. We've seen cases involving protesters. We saw Occupy Wall Street. We saw other types of movements. One thing those protesters don't do is run around the city committing violent acts. What they do is they hold signs up. We see union protesters in our cities all the time. In Detroit, I'm used to it. They hold signs up, they walk peacefully, they engage in peaceful time and place protests that are appropriate. Well, these aren't protesters. What they do is they find out the location of ICE, they engage in these groups that report on the location of ICE agents, and then once they find out a confirmed ICE target, they swarm it with the video cameras, they engage in obstructionist conduct, and they make it appear as if ICE is all over the city, as if there's riots all over the city. But in reality, these are just the same few hundred people descending on each and every area. How did they get so organized? How did they get so coordinated? How were they able to pull this off? Well, that's where we get to our main subject of the day, a gentleman named Neville Roy Singham. Now, a very boisterous, and boy, do I say boisterous, Bill O'Reilly was screaming about this gentleman recently on, I believe it was News Nation. He was somebody that he said people should be talking about, and I certainly heeded the call here because I'd heard this name before, and I understood what he was up to, and I figured it was very important that we get to the bottom of it, or at least put a story out about it, because it's the real reason you're seeing disruption in your American cities, and particularly Minneapolis, right now. Neville Roy Singham is an American tech billionaire turned Shanghai-based socialist who's funneled millions into radical causes worldwide. He was born in 1954, and he ran a large tech company that he later sold for millions and millions of dollars, which he has decided now to use on philanthropic causes, like supporting riotous protests. His IT firm ThoughtWorks was sold for $785 million in 2017. But here's the hook. The philanthropy that he engaged in wasn't charity. Per the New York Times and congressional reports, he donated $275 million to pro-China, opaque 501c3 and other outlets. Some of that was used to directly fund the riots and protests that we see in Minnesota. Evidence from House Oversight Committee probes in June 2025 linked Singham to funding groups like the Minnesota Immigration Rights Action Committee, Democratic Socialists of America, and Party for Socialism and Liberation. They are all active anti-ICE actions. Fox News Digital uncovered encrypted chats mobilizing before the Preety shooting tied to Singham-backed networks. These signal chats were tied to Singham. He's funneled $20 million to the People's Forum in NYC, which organizes Shut It Down for Palestine protests and anti-ICE campaigns that spilled into Minnesota. Now, is this guy anti-ICE? Is he pro-Hamas? No, he's actually just a Maoist in China trying to disrupt America as much as possible, trying to get into the minds of your youth, trying to get in the minds of your children, trying to get into the minds of anybody who will listen so he can pollute it for his own cause, which is generally to create as much disruption in the United States of America as possible. He's using our free speech against us. In India, his 5 million news to click sparked money laundering probes for inciting protests. In the US, he's backed Code Pink. That's his wife's group with 1.4 million for anti-war demos that morph into border obstruction. Singham denies direct CCP control, claiming ideological alignment, but it's pretty clear that he is actually controlled by the Chinese government. Is he alone? Absolutely not. Congressional trackers and Washington Examiner reports point to George Soros's Open Society Foundation as being another funding source, which is donated to Antifa-linked groups and pro-Venezuela protests overlapping with Minnesota actions. We've got Singham, we've got George Soros, we've got millions of dollars funneling into these areas. This is where they get their signs from. This is where they get their organization. This is where they get their material. But most importantly, this is where they get trained algorithms and social media posts designed to specifically target your youth. Your friends, your colleagues, your neighbors may be brought to tears by what they're seeing on their Instagram feed related to Hamas, but it may very well be carefully staged by a Chinese Maoist CCP sympathizer who's doing nothing but trying to pollute the brains of American citizens. Mainstream liberal foundations and charities with ties to extremist groups fund PSL and Answer Coalition. They were involved in the LA riots that mirrored Minnesota's. A January 2026 report on pro-Maduro demonstrations tied these to CCP-aligned entities as well. Just about all of these causes that are against what Donald Trump is doing are funded by these outside groups. Some funding supports legitimate advocacy like education programs, but a lot of it obstructs law enforcement and it crosses the line. If donors knew the violent intents and the liability spikes and the implications of these sorts of donations when they're used to engage in actions that are potentially punishable by the federal criminal laws of the United States, you think they would think twice about giving. But of course, Singham lives outside of the United States, and while he's currently under investigation by federal authorities, I don't imagine he intends on returning anytime soon. Now, the Minnesota mess has ignited a political inferno. From corporate America calling for de-escalation to Senate Democrats refusing DHS fundings after the shootings, things are very polarized in the United States right now. Republicans generally revolt against unchecked force. Democrats have been crying about invasions. There's been a hotbed of political implications on both sides, but we know it's eroding public safety. It's causing government shutdowns, which we may be facing a whole nother one. And sometimes these protests turn into riots that actually hurt people and destroy property, which is not something we want. On January 26, 2026, Trump engaged in a pretty grand pivot right after the most recent incident that we will go into a bit later. We see that there has been some people marred by a bit of the tragedy in this situation. And the concern here is that this keeps going on, a powder keg may turn into something more serious. And Donald Trump is a lot smarter than that. So he knows that these protests are being funded by outside sources. He knows that Tim Walz needs these people around so that he can continue to get elected over and over again. But the one thing he can do, Donald Trump, politically to end all of this is exactly what I told him to do when I was on Newsmax just the other day, and he complied about a day later. Now, did he see it? I don't know. Did his people see it? I don't know. But I stood before the American people on Newsmax and I said the best thing that Donald Trump can do is back off of the ICE raids, and he can tell Governor Tim Walz that he's got one last opportunity to clean up his city, to clean up his state, to send the illegal, undocumented aliens outside of his city walls when they have federal criminal convictions, state criminal convictions, and when they have convictions that are related to violent offenses. And that's exactly what Donald Trump did, wisely. He backed off and he said, I'm going to change leadership and see what we can do to deal with these ICE raids. But Governor Walz, I'm willing to work with you, but you've got to work with me. If you've got criminals in your midst and if you're protecting them, you've got to follow federal law and you've got to allow us to deport them. We won't do raids, but you've got to do our job and help us out in the process. Remember, the danger here was created by Walz running a sanctuary city, not by Donald Trump. These people would have been slowly deported, consistent with their criminal convictions, at a time when they were already captured for the crime that they engaged in. They wouldn't have stayed in this country. They wouldn't have grown roots. They would have been politely removed out the right way. Governor Walz created this mess, and Donald Trump is saying, you've created it, you help clean it up. Right now, Walz is looking at the spilled milk on the ground. Donald Trump has sent people to come in and clean it. And Governor Walz is slapping his hand back and saying, you can't clean up my spilled milk. Well, that's not the way it's going to be, Walz. You're going to clean up your own milk, or the government's going to have to come back in one more time and do it for you. Now, in response to the PR saying that Governor Walz and Donald Trump are somewhat engaged in a bit of an agreement, the protesters turned on Walz. They stormed his Capitol and most recently were filmed outside of his Capitol with signs arguing that he's not doing enough. He made a deal with the devil, and now the devil's biting him back a bit, which is very unfortunate for Tim Walz, but I won't cry too much over that sort of spilt milk. So could funders like Singham face any sort of charges for the funding of these protests? And my answer to that is absolutely yes. First of all, engaging in these types of actions against ICE, not protests, as I've already said, it's riotous conduct. It is clear obstruction of justice. Engaging in a conspiracy to obstruct justice is a conspiracy to violate the laws of the United States, at a very minimum chargeable by 18 U.S.C. 371, a very popular charge for the feds. But in addition to that, it could also be a RICO conspiracy. Remember, we have nonprofit fraud going on in these places, pulling government money out and allocating it outside of the United States. That's what Ilhan Omar has done. That's the subject of a prior episode that I taped a while ago. Well, that money is getting outside the United States and it's finding itself back in the United States in the hands of these sorts of protesters who are protesting ICE raids and all of that. When there's a central source of funding doing all of this, and that individual is at the heart of it, and Tim Walz is aiding it through his policies, that are a violation of federal law, and he's going before the American people and the people of his community on camera and saying we are not going to help ICE and in fact obstruct them. And when apparently some people in his administration are involved in signal chats organizing these demonstrations that aren't demonstrations but really riotous and obstructionist conduct, we have the makings of a pretty solid RICO conspiracy. Now, RICO isn't just tied to the mob. In fact, I'm out here in Philadelphia dealing with a RICO case on the defense side. Often RICO is 2 or more criminal actions related to an organization that was designed for the purpose of engaging in criminal action. That's what a lot of these nonprofit entities are doing when they are just fronts. I talked about this funding Mamdani's campaign in New York, and the same thing is happening in Minnesota. You are seeing illegal actors violate campaign financing laws, obstruct justice in the United States, obstruct proper elections in the United States through using funding from illegitimate and illegal sources. And while Donald Trump was charged with many of these things, these crimes could actually be proven against these individuals. Mamdani could be charged with it. Walz could be charged with it. Ilhan Omar could be charged with it. And I wouldn't be surprised to see Pam Bondi start bringing some RICO charges down on these individuals. Subpoenas are already flying. We're probably going to see some action pretty soon. Now, the most common comment I get from you in the comment section of Off Air, and I love all of you, I promise you, I love all of you. But the most common comment I get is, hey, nothing's going to happen. Well, that's true. It can be frustrating, ladies and gentlemen. It can be frustrating seeing nothing happen when all of this disruption is happening in the United States. But just like Tulsi Gabbard's investigation of Barack Obama, just like Pam Bondi's investigation in Minnesota, just like the investigations against Jim Comey and the current investigation against Hillary Clinton, we've been watching a lot of these investigations go down, and we haven't seen a ton of indictments. Well, these things take time to do them right. The charges against Jim Comey were rushed. They weren't done properly. We can't do that again. In order to see the real type of justice, the type of justice that sticks and holds people accountable for real things, it can't be a headline. We need real investigations. Listen, I believe in the Fifth and Sixth Amendment to the United States Constitution. Everybody deserves a fair trial. They deserve due process. They deserve intelligent and talented counsel to take care of that process for them. And I want to see even Governor Tim Walz, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama get the right counsel and the right process that they deserve, which also means the right type of investigation. So for those of you growing impatient, I hear you. I'm with you. I'm going to be with you all along the way. We're going to be talking about it all along the way. Make sure you hit like and subscribe, smash the bell button so you can get updates when I talk about future issues. We'll be back in Minnesota pretty soon. In fact, I'm thinking I might really need to make a site visit there. So let me know if you think I should get boots on the ground and talk to some people. That would remind me of my old Marine Corps days, and I wouldn't mind doing it. Once again, this is Off Air. I'm federal criminal defense attorney Ron Chapman. Thank you for sticking around with me this evening. I pay attention to all of the comments, but what I love seeing are comments from members. If you get a chance and you want to support the channel with a membership, feel free to log in, become a member. I try to respond to all of my member comments. Thank you so much, all of those loyal listeners out there. I look forward to hearing what you have to say about this episode. Like it, share it, let your friends know about it. I'm Ron Chapman. This is Off Air. Thanks for joining.